Dude, where's my self-driving car? That's the question a lot of us have been asking, as the last 10 to 15 years have seen many promises about the future of self-driving cars, and it seems like not a lot of delivering. But that may be changing. Timothy Lee is a journalist who writes the Substack Understanding AI, and he has written a series of articles in the last week about the state of the self-driving car industry. He joins the podcast to talk about whether or not we're going to see self-driving cars in a city near you very soon, the challenges of long-haul trucking self-driving versus passenger self-driving inside cities, whether or not regulatory or technical challenges are the real hurdle to getting self-driving approved faster, and ultimately what impact self-driving cars at scale could have on society. As always, thank you for listening. If you want to like, subscribe, leave a comment, all of that is very appreciated. If you want to really support the podcast, you can do so by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Members get access to exclusive episodes for members only. They get access to our community Slack with other organizers, and they connect with local organizers in their area. So become a member of the Center for New Liberalism today. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Timothy Lee. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So, we are talking today about self-driving cars, and you've just published a series of articles on your Substack, Understanding AI, which is excellent, by the way. Everybody should go subscribe to Understanding AI if you're interested in understanding AI. It's very self-explanatory. But you kind of had what you called Autonomy Week, where you did 5 articles in 5 days about the state of self-driving cars, the state of whether you want to call them autonomous driving or AI-powered driving or whatever you want what the name to be. And I guess I'm curious, we can start at a very high level. Where do you see the state of the industry today? Because I think a lot of people, when they think about this, they are reflexively pretty skeptical. Like, oh, I've heard about self-driving cars, 15 years ago, and I heard about them 10 years ago, and I heard about them 5 years ago, and I'm still hearing about them today, and it all sounds like science fiction. And I think a lot of people are skeptical this is ever going to actually get there. But what is the actual kind of state of the industry right now?
Yeah, so people have good reason to be skeptical because there was a period in the late 2010s when a lot of money was put into this industry. A lot of people made some unrealistic projections about, like Ford, for example, said they were going to have a car with no steering wheel by 2021. And obviously that never happened. And so that soured a lot of people. And so there was a period in 2021, 2022, when a lot of people were saying, oh, this technology is decades away. But now it's a real technology that exists. You can go to San Francisco or Phoenix and you can hail a car from Waymo, which is the Google self-driving car company. And it works. There's nobody in the driver's seat. They've done tens of millions of miles now of fully driverless rides. They have an excellent safety record. And so there's at least one company out there that has a honest to goodness driverless taxi service that is exactly what everybody said was going to happen. Now, it's not available nationally yet because it's a taxi service that works like Uber or Lyft. And so they're growing geographically. And so right now it's in Phoenix and San Francisco. They just started in Los Angeles. They're going to do Austin and Atlanta next year, and I expect probably several other cities. And then 2026, 2027, I expect to see, several more, maybe dozens more cities. And by the end of the decade, I would not be surprised if there was Waymo service in every major city in America. And then there are a bunch of other companies that are a little far behind. Waymo has a pretty big lead, but there are several companies that are working on driverless long-haul trucking. There are several companies that are preparing to enter the driverless taxi market, like Waymo is, and there's also a few companies that are working on driverless delivery services.
Do you think that we have kind of switched up from we used to be in this era of public perception where people really overestimated how fast this was going to happen. Like you said, like Ford said, we're going to have cars without steering wheels by 2021. And Elon Musk certainly has over and over and over, like, demonstrated that he's way too aggressive on like how fast Teslas are going to be self-driving cars or what, robo taxis or whatever the case may be. He's been very aggressive and it's had to walk those back. And so we kind of had this era of like overestimating it. But do you actually think that the general public is now underestimating like this stuff actually exists and it's going to start growing really, really fast, really soon?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's been for a couple years. Waymo started their driverless service in October 2020 in Phoenix. And so for the last 4 years, I've been writing about this, and I've seen people write like driverless technology is impossible. It's never going to work. And it's like, look, guys, like you can go to Phoenix and see it. So I think that's been true for a while. What the weird thing the first couple of years was Waymo was not growing very fast. They were basically just in Phoenix. They seemed kind of stuck there, and they were refining the technology. But they've grown from 10,000 rides a week in August 2023 to 100,000 rides a week in August 2024. So over 1 year, they grew by 10x. I don't know if they'll grow quite that fast in the coming year, but I expect them to be several times larger a year from now than they are now. So yeah, I think they're in that kind of exponential part of the curve where, I think it's going to be a lot bigger. But again, because it's geographic, if you live in, say, New York City, it's just going to take Waymo a while to get there, especially because I think snow is one of the challenges that they haven't fully solved. And then also New York City is probably going to be one of the kind of heavier regulatory jurisdictions. So it might take a while to get approval. And so, yeah, there's that saying like the future is here is just unevenly distributed. That's like even more true for self-driving than it is for a lot of other technologies.
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever I think about this, I actually think about one of the kind of totemic ideas of progress of technology is flying cars, right? There's a book called Dude, Where's My Flying Car? That's like about, why we don't have flying cars and then about the transportation industry. It's actually by another Tim. I think it's Tim Jackson who wrote that. And then, there's the famous Peter Thiel quote about like, I think it was Peter Thiel who said something like, we were promised jetpacks and flying cars and we got social networks instead. That might not be Thiel. I might be making that up, but somebody said.
Yeah, that's Joe. I think he said we wanted flying cars and we got 104 characters.
Yeah,
exactly.
But just it's this totemic idea, and I think like a lot of people have kind of internalized that as actually like mixing it up in their heads as self-driving cars are not ever going to happen. Like it's the famous example of the thing that's not happening, except that as you've pointed out, it is now happening. And I guess, as you think about kind of this pathway towards broad acceptance, maybe we look at the world 50 years from now and maybe almost all trips are self-driven by robots, right? I wonder how we get there. And I wonder, in your mind, are the greater challenges technical challenges or regulatory challenges in the next 5 to 10 years for like actually getting this to be broadly accepted?
I mean, it's hard to compare them. I would say that so far the regulatory challenges have been pretty minimal. This stuff is mostly regulated at the state level. At least it has been so far. And California has one of the stricter regimes. But despite that, like Waymo has managed to roll out their service in California without too much difficulty. And other states like Texas and Arizona and Florida that are pretty permissive. And so I do think that there's going to be, I think the Northeast probably is going to have, there's going to be some regulatory headaches there where I could see it being delayed there. But because it gets rolled out geography by geography, I think there's several years of expansion they can do in the states where they're friendly. And I don't see regulatory stuff being a big barrier. A lot of the kind of near to the medium term challenges, just the logistics of manufacturing the cars, hiring the support staff. I mean, so if you have a fully driverless car and it gets a flat tire, there's nobody in it. You need somebody who can go out and change the flat tire. And so, if you're going to run a driverless taxi service, you got to have staff in every city. So there's a lot of those kind of logistical challenges that either Waymo needs to solve themselves or they need to strike deals. For example, they just struck a deal with Uber to do an exclusive partnership in Austin and Atlanta, where the only way you'll be able to get a Waymo is through the Uber app, and Uber will do a lot of the maintenance instead of Waymo. So that helps Waymo scale faster. It helps, keeps Uber kind of front of mind for customers, and that'll help them scale up. So they need to do a bunch of those kind of deals or hire a bunch of people in order to become a national and eventually a global service.
Interesting. So in your mind, it's not so much the regulation or the technology as much as just they've got a bunch of kind of very boring, very business school style logistics challenges. They've got to manage supply chains. They've got to manage, real world scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, it's all those things. But yes, I don't think there's either at this point, there's neither like a big technical breakthrough that's needed or a big piece of legislation that needs to be changed. There's just lots of, just stuff they need to grind through in kind of a banal business scenario.
Well, let's talk about how this plays politically, because this is obviously a political podcast that you're on.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent some time in advance of this episode talking to a few friends and colleagues and family members about their thoughts on self-driving cars and, would you get in one? How do you feel about it? And while there were some people who were, technology excited, these are people who are very much like you or I, most likely, who are excited by new technology, who like to get deep in the weeds of policy, who, you and I are both big nerds. And I talked to some people like that who were very positive. But I also talked to some people who were more negative, who were saying, look, I don't trust that. I want somebody behind the wheel. I want to know if something goes wrong, if some unexpected situation happens, that there's somebody there to actually make a responsible decision. How do you think about that kind of thing? And I know you've written about this pretty extensively at points, but what do you think when you think about that kind of skepticism that still does exist out there?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of factual things we should mention. One is that there's nobody behind the wheel, but Waymo, and I expect all of these companies, does have a remote operator who's not driving the vehicle, but is available in the case of problems. You can push a button and call them, or if the car comes up to a situation it doesn't understand or it detects some kind of error, it'll send a message back to the mothership, and a person will kind of look in through the cameras and see what's happening and provide feedback. So it's not like the car's going to get stranded on the freeway and then you'll just be stuck there forever. Like, they have a pretty good backup system. So that's number one. Number two, I think that I really think this is a problem that'll go away pretty naturally as people have a chance to try that technology. I first tried Waymo's commercial service in March. I went out to San Francisco and took 6 rides over the course of a couple days. The first time I was like really excited. I took a video of every second of it. It was, I was like kind of looking around to see, is the car going to like do anything interesting? Is it going to have any problems? And it was totally uneventful. It drove perfectly. There were no problems. And so by the 4th, 5th, 6th trip, it was really a struggle not to like pull out a book and read, because it was just like the car was driving like a boring human. And so I certainly
you got too cool, Tim. You got too cool for it. You got too cool to care about it.
I mean, not even too cool. It's just like it just becomes in the same way if you're like, if you're riding in a taxi, like maybe you want to talk to the taxi driver, but if you don't, like, it's not like interesting to stare out the window because you're not like worried they're going to run into something. And so I think because this is because it's logistically challenging to roll it out quickly, what'll happen is they'll go into a new city, and initially only 1% of people who want it can try it. And so the early adopters will try it. And then just by word of mouth, like people, a lot of people will be skeptical for a while, but then there'll be some time somebody invites you or you just need a ride, and so you try it, and then they'll realize it's totally boring. And so then I think pretty quickly, people are afraid in the abstract, but when they see how it actually operates, I think they'll be pretty comfortable with it. And the third thing to say is that we're starting to get data. I think it's still pretty early, so we can't say anything definitive about the risk of fatal crashes. But if you look at serious crashes short of fatal, ones that cause an injury or trigger an airbag, Waymo vehicles seem to be about 3 to 6 times less likely to get into a serious crash compared to similar human drivers on the same types of roads in those cities. And so if that continues to be the case, and I expect that it will, I think we'll reach a point probably in about 2 years where the argument will be kind of flipped on its head. And it's not like, is it safe enough to have self-driving cars? It's more like, do you want to take the risk of having a human drive you? I think we're a very long way away from any kind of debate about whether should we start restricting people from driving their cars. But I think that safety will be a selling point for these vehicles as opposed to a cause for concern for people.
In a country like America, with the views that we have about guns, I find it very hard to think that we would restrict people's ability to drive just because it was dangerous. I'm not expressing an opinion on guns here, but just if we treat the Second Amendment the way we do, I don't think we're going to ever restrict driving. But I do think there's an element of this. It's kind of like the devil you know versus the devil you don't.
Mhm.
The people are comfortable with a risk, even if it's a greater risk that they're familiar with, as opposed to this kind of unknown thing that's scary. And maybe, as you said, maybe the only solution to change people's minds is to make it less unknown, to make
Yeah.
it known and commonplace and boring.
Mhm.
Um, but how does this, can you provide some more detail on the actual safety information we have? Like, are driverless cars from Waymo, are they causing crashes? If so, what do we know about the nature of the crashes and who's at fault in these crashes? I know you've kind of done a deep dive on this. So
Yeah.
what exactly do we know about kind of the nature of safety when it comes to these cars? And does it break down by like different locations, whether they're on the freeway, whether they're on side streets, things like that?
Yeah. Okay. So before I get to that, I should mention the one other like big limitation these vehicles have is they don't provide service on freeways yet. That is something they are testing both in Phoenix and San Francisco. I think probably in the coming months, there's a good chance they will start offering commercial service on freeways. They don't yet. So in terms of the safety, the great thing about these vehicles is they've got all sorts of sensors on them. They're always connected, to the internet. And so Waymo knows immediately as soon as there's a crash, they know exactly how many times these vehicles have crashed. And the tricky thing actually is figuring out how many times human beings crash, because if a human being gets in a kind of minor accident, they might not tell the police, they might not tell their insurance company. And so if you just look at the raw number of crashes by Waymo versus number of crashes that are reported by people, it's going to be a little unfair to Waymo because there are going to be some human crashes that didn't get reported, and Waymo is going to know about all the ones where they got it. But if you try to adjust for that, even in a pretty conservative way, you find that Waymo vehicles crash significantly less. So Waymo has done, through June, which is the last time the data has been released, Waymo has done 22 million miles of driving. And during that period of time, there were 23 crashes where either somebody was claimed an injury or there's an airbag deployed. And Waymo has released some benchmark data that experts have told me is pretty well done for human drivers that suggests that if you looked at human drivers in the same two metro areas in Phoenix and San Francisco, that the injury rate is about 1/3 the rate of human drivers, and the airbag crash rate is about 1/6 the rate of human drivers. So rather than 23, you'd have rather than about 20 injuries, you'd have about 60 injuries, and rather than about 5 crashes, you'd have about airbag crashes. You'd have about 30 airbag crashes. So that's a big reduction. In terms of the nature of the crashes, of those 23 crashes, I believe 16 of them were rear end crashes where the Waymo was in the front. So the Waymo was either already stopped at a light or maybe slowed down for a stop sign or something, and then another car came up from behind and smashed into them. Now, I think you can make an argument there's maybe a little bit of fault for Waymo in some of those if it braked in a kind of, unexpected way. But
that's actually like an existential question for me, is like, I think it's pretty common for people, pulling up to a stop sign or a red light or whatever to kind of not stop as quickly or as judiciously as they should or as completely. And I'm guessing Waymos are actually way more law-abiding and rule-abiding and cautious. And
yes,
to some level, I think probably what's happening is that the Waymo is following the letter of the law very precisely, and people aren't used to that. And so
yeah.
they're rear-ending Waymos that are actually like fully stopping at these stop signs.
Yes, I think it's quite possible some of those are that. But there's also ones where people are clearly speeding or the Waymo was already stopped before the crash happened. So I think there's a mix of things. A few of those you could say maybe that's a little too cautious. But for the most part, I'd say if you're getting rear-ended, it wasn't your fault. And then the remaining like 6 or 7, 3 of them were red lights. Interestingly, 2 of those 3 were people fleeing the police and ran red lights and crashed into people. Then there were a couple of cases where another vehicle cut the Waymo off or turned in front of it in a way where I think the other vehicle had at least some of the blame. But again, you could say maybe the Waymo should have been more cautious. So that means out of 23 crashes, maybe a third, you could argue that Waymo had a role, but probably the human driver was at fault. And the other 2/3, I think it was very clearly the human driver. So that's another way I think you can say it just seems like if you look like the kind of which way the fault usually runs, the vast majority of the time it seems like it's more the human driver hit the Waymo versus the Waymo hit a human driver.
Very interesting. And I mean, obviously, if you're a technologist, if you are, somebody who's excited about this technology, you want to shout this from the rooftops. But
Mhm.
and some people will be suspicious that, like, oh, of course, Waymo's numbers say that Waymo is much safer. But
Yeah.
but having looked at this as kind of an independent voice, do you think that the numbers are pretty legit?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two questions. One question is, are they reporting all the crashes accurately? And the other question is their benchmark good? The are they reporting the questions accurately question? It's hard to know for sure, but I think that there's enough public interest in this, and there has been enough media coverage of the crashes that have happened, that I think it's unlikely that there've been a ton of crashes that they haven't reported. I mean, it'd be a pretty risky thing for Waymo to do, to like deliberately cover up a major crash. And so I think probably the number of crashes is accurate. And then in terms of the human benchmark, the expert I've talked to have said that they did a pretty good job. But even if you don't adjust for the underreporting, it's still significantly less. It's I think 60% less rather than 70% less for injuries. So yeah, I think I find this data pretty convincing. I think you can debate whether it's like a little safer or a lot safer, but I think that you have fewer of these injury and airbag crashes. The one category I think you can't say anything is the one we care the most about, which is fatal crashes. And that's because human vehicles, a human-driven vehicle only gets in a fatal crash about once every 50 million miles. And so Waymo's only driven 22 million miles, so it's had 0 fatal crashes, but you can't draw any inferences from that yet, because you would expect somebody who's only driven 22 million miles to not get into a fatal crash. And so when they get to...
and you wouldn't even be able to, not for a while then, because if it's the rate is 1 per 50 million miles, driving 50 million miles is not enough to distinguish the difference, right? You're probably going to need to drive at minimum hundreds of millions of miles to kind of get a true rate, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you get to 50 million, you could say it's like better than a coin flip that is probably safer, but to get to statistical significance, you probably need 150, 200 million miles, something like that. And so it'll be, I expect them to hit that point sometime next year in 2026. So at that point, I think you'll be able to make a really strong case for safety, but I think it's unlikely that they're like dramatically lower in, injury and airbag crashes, where I think we do have statistical significance, but then for some reason it's like much more likely for fatalities. So my guess is that it's safer overall, but to really make a strong, scientifically defensible case, I think we'll probably need another 12 to 18 months of data.
One of the things that, and you mentioned this briefly earlier, but one of the things that I find really fascinating is the idea of self-driving pickup trucks, and not pickup trucks, I'm sorry, like semis, 18-wheelers, whatever you want to call those giant things that haul our goods around. And kind of, I remember my popular conception of self-driving cars comes from 2 movies, basically. One of them is Minority Report, which has these very cool self-driving pods that kind of go around this futuristic-looking highway system. And Minority Report, great movie. But there was also a movie that didn't feature it in such a flashy way. But I don't know if you've ever seen the film Logan, which is like a Wolverine movie. It's about like old man Wolverine. And just as kind of a backdrop to that movie, they never even really mention it, but you see these self-driving 18-wheelers just going up and down the highway with nobody inside them. And it's like not even remarked upon, but this is like a feature of what the future looks like.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking like, wow, that's actually like a really realistic portrayal of what we might see. And so I've always thought that was like a really, I don't know, it's something I've been thinking about. Why can't we automate that faster? Why is it so much harder to do stuff on the freeway, or so much harder to do stuff with these giant 18-wheelers when, that's something like people have been talking about that for years. Andrew Yang used to say, like, we have 5 million truckers and they're all going to be unemployed in 10 years because of AI. And are we close to that? Is anybody working on that problem?
Lots of people are working on it. So it's an interesting case because on average, I would say freeways are easier to navigate. There's well-marked lanes, mostly straight. There's no pedestrians or bicyclists around. And so it's pretty easy to make a freeway driver assistance system that's like 99% accurate. Like Tesla certainly has one of those, and a lot of other vehicle, like I've got a Kia that does pretty well in staying its lane in the freeway. The difficult thing is that the default way that these that self-driving vehicles maintain safety is they have a very cautious driving style, where with a Waymo vehicle on a surface street, if it's not sure what to do, it just slows down and comes to a stop and waits for remote assistance. it's able to do this infrequently enough that it doesn't annoy other drivers too much. But, you'd rather have it do that than, bluster into a situation it doesn't understand, right? And so with a freeway, if you're going 70 miles an hour and you've got a 40-ton semi-truck, that's much, much harder to do. And so you need a much higher level of driving performance in order to do that safely, because you need to be able to get to an exit or a wide shoulder or, some kind of other safe pull-off location, which might be quite a ways down the freeway. And you need to be able to slow to a stop in a way that doesn't cause a pileup or, ideally even a traffic jam. And so Waymo, as I think I mentioned before, they don't do freeways yet because for this reason, I think it's the hardest problem. And there are a few companies that are working on self-driving trucks. And the leading one at this point is a company called Aurora that's been around for about 8 years. They've raised over $1 billion. And they have said that they are going to do their first driverless trip by the end of this calendar year in Texas between Dallas and Houston. And so if everything goes well for them, they'll do that first trip later this year. And then they're talking about doing, I think they've said 10 million miles next year and 125 million miles in 2026 with these trucks. And so then it would become a big industry. And one of the appealing things for them is that it's a bigger industry and also I think an easier industry to generate business for. A taxi business is a consumer-facing business. You really have to build a lot of infrastructure in a lot of different cities and do a lot of marketing and build an app and stuff to really to get a big market. Whereas with trucking, if you get deals from a few big customers, there are large manufacturers or wholesalers or whoever that can, buy hundreds of truck trips every week. And so you can grow much quicker and the overall size of the market is larger. So if they can make it work, it's going to be a very good business for them. But it's a higher level of difficulty, I think, than the robotaxi case.
I mean, in addition to what you're saying, which is totally valid, that like the stakes are higher on a freeway than they are in a side street, a normal road where you can kind of just pull over and stop, and it usually is not too disruptive. But on a freeway, that would be massively disruptive, and the consequences for getting something wrong are bigger on a freeway, right? Especially when you have a giant truck like that. It also just strikes me that it's harder to drive these trucks. Like, are they planning to just have this as a freeway service, and or is the self-driving technology also going to be piloting these giant 18-wheeler trucks through kind of side streets where traditionally it would actually be pretty difficult to get these trucks through certain streets and certain avenues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Aurora's initial business model is, like you said, they're going to have a depot in each city. There's a depot south of Dallas and a depot north of Houston. And so the model will be the customer will have some other human driver drive from the origin warehouse to this depot, get out of the car, the trailer will be switched to the driverless truck. The driverless truck will drive the 200 miles to the Houston depot, and then somebody will get in and drive the truck the last 5 miles or whatever it is to its final destination. And this could have, I think that'll be the kind of dominant approach for the first couple of years, at least for 18-wheelers. And I think this could actually have some nice impacts on the job market, because long-haul trucking is a really unpleasant job, just in terms of you're on the road all the time, you don't see your family that much, and you got to kind of work at all different hours and sleep in your truck. And so if that's converted into jobs where the people do local delivery in the kind of crowded streets and do paperwork and help unload the trucks, and the driverless cars do the boring 1,000-mile trip from Phoenix to Dallas or whatever it is, I think that could be kind of win-win for everybody, especially if if driverless technology drives down the cost of shipping a little bit. You could actually have the total volume of stuff shipped go up, and so there could be additional jobs in kind of last mile delivery and warehousing and stuff. And so it could be kind of jobs that allow people to be with their families, along with kind of greater efficiency of the overall system.
Do you worry about the things that Andrew Yang worries about, where we're going to see a deluge of millions of unemployed truckers, or do you think that is so far in the future it's not worth worrying about right now?
I would say I'm a little bit worried about it. I think so. So the classic example to think about here is automatic teller machines in the 80s and 90s, where if you look at the jobs data, the number of human tellers didn't actually decline between, I think, roughly 1980 and 2010, when all these ATMs were going in. And the reason was that banks still needed tellers for certain purposes. And so what happened was, as bank branches got more ATMs put in, the number of tellers you needed to run a bank branch went down. The cost of running a bank branch went down. And so there was this proliferation of new bank branches. So the total number of tellers didn't change that much. Now, more recently, that the number of tellers has declined in the last 10 or 15 years, as people have shifted from to totally cashless to using a debit card or Venmo or whatever. And so, eventually that's an industry that goes out of business. But that's a profession that's going to become increasingly scarce. But if you were a bank teller in 1990, you could have a nice long 30-year career before those jobs get eliminated. And I envision a similar thing with trucking. If you started, I wouldn't necessarily recommend somebody go into trucking if they have other options. But if you're say you're a 30-year-old trucker right now and you hope to have a 30-year career ahead of you, it'll take 5 or 10 years before these long haul trucking services are at a scale where it really starts to cut into to demand for truckers. I mean, right now there's a trucking shortage. Like these companies, there's always companies trying to hire more truckers.
This is something where I like to make fun of Andrew Yang a lot, and that's my personal failure, is that I just really like to make fun of him. That as soon as he said this, literally almost as you can look at a chart of like trucking demand for trucking, and as soon as he said it, we entered a critical shortage of truck drivers, and we've not really emerged from that for years. So it's always just very funny to me. But that's my personal little hobby horse.
Yeah, totally. So I think if you're a 30-year-old trucker today, you probably have 10 more years where there'll be plenty of demand for long-haul trucking because only a minority of the trucking fleet will be automated. After that, you'd probably have to shift to different sectors where, for example, there's a lot of, I think, truck driving jobs where you are kind of more on the delivery end, where say you work for Coca-Cola and you deliver, cases of Coca-Cola to retail stores. And often those jobs, the truck driver's job is also to like take the forklift and like bring the cases into the trucks. And so there'll be different, I think the nature of the job will shift, but I think there will still be plenty of people in jobs adjacent to trucking. And so, people might have to kind of evolve what they do. But I just don't understand. I just don't expect, armies of unemployed truckers. And then at a broader perspective, like I think this kind of innovation will make the economy grow faster and raise wages. And so I think there will be plenty of other jobs available for people. And so, I wouldn't like encourage somebody to go into trucking, but I think it'll be quite a gradual process, and anybody who kind of has their eyes open and are kind of thinking about the long term will be able to make a graceful transition to doing something else, 10 or 20 years down the road.
I want to switch a little bit and talk about the actual technology behind what's happening here, because there have been, in AI generally, a lot of huge breakthroughs in the last few years, right? We've seen the rise of large language models, and we are in this kind of period of like AI is producing astonishing new things. And sometimes they're still in that uncanny valley of like, you can kind of tell that they're not quite human, but it's still astonishing what they're able to do despite that.
Yep.
And I'm curious, is the technology behind self-driving cars, which is a form of AI, certainly, is it related to kind of the breakthroughs that we've seen with large language models? Is it a completely different form of technology? Is it trained in the same way? What do we know about the actual technological breakthroughs that have allowed us to make self-driving cars that now operate as safely as they do?
So this is a pretty fast changing picture. So if you go back 15 years ago, or actually 20 years ago now, that this industry started out, there was a series of challenges called the DARPA Grand Challenge, where the U.S. military wanted to have mostly academic teams build a car that could drive itself autonomously across the desert. And then when they were successful at doing that in 2005, they had an urban challenge where they had a fake city, and you had to kind of drive around city streets and follow traffic laws. And the key breakthrough for that was a technology called LiDAR, which is a sensor that sends out laser pulses and builds a 3D map of the surrounding area. And so the first generation of self-driving cars from 2007 through about 2019 had a kind of traditional robotics approach where it used a lot of sensors to map out the environment around the vehicle very carefully. And then it had kind of traditional computer code that tried to figure out, build a model of the world and then figure out what's a safe path. in 2017, the transformer was invented, which is the technology underlying large language models. And over the next around 2020, 2021, probably, self-driving car companies started experimenting with that. And they have found that the transformer is very flexible. So the original application was for natural language, for predicting the next token in a chat conversation or language translation. But they found it also could be used for other things. One thing it's very good at is you can model the behavior of traffic as with a transformer. So just as a large language model predicts the next word, you can have a model that predicts the next action that a car will take, turning the steering wheel, pushing the brakes, stuff like that. And so one of the core pieces of any self-driving car is you need a prediction engine where you say, okay, here's the current situation, here's the position and velocity of all the vehicles, what's likely to happen in the next second, the next 2 seconds, the next 3 seconds, because obviously you need to know what the other cars are doing in order to intelligently decide what you're going to do. And so Waymo in particular published a paper a couple of years ago describing a technique to use a transformer to do that, where rather than trying to hand code, like here are the rules that cars will follow and here's how you figure out what it's going to do next, they just gave it a bunch of hands-on data. Say here's 100,000 recorded sequences of cars moving, and from that, in the same way the large language model learns to predict the next word, it would predict here's how I think this traffic situation will unfold. And so a bunch of the companies that were started in the 2010s had that old-fashioned approach, have been rebuilding their autonomy stacks based on this kind of technology, where rather than trying to kind of hand code, have a human being try to sit down and write down, well, what are all the rules that a self-driving car should follow? They just throw a lot of data at it and say, like, look at how actual humans are driving and kind of do it like that. And that turns out to be surprisingly efficient, and you end up with cars that drive much more smoothly. The early self-driving cars would, be kind of a little bit robotic. They would kind of start and stop as they get confused, or they would, be a little too robotic and like always staying in the middle of the lane. And this new generation of cars are much smoother. They have a much better idea of how much distance should I keep from the car ahead of me, how much should I, if I'm going around somebody, when is it safe to do that, and how much room should I leave, stuff like that. They're much more natural drivers in that sense, which I think is, even though in some cases it may not follow the letter of the law. I mean, so for example, if you have, say you're in a city street and the car in front of you stops and you have to cross the yellow line to go around the vehicle, like obviously people do that in cities all the time, but it's a little hard to write down like what are the exact criteria about when is it a good idea to do that. But if you have 100,000 examples of real cars doing this, then you can kind of intuit, okay, here are the situations where it's appropriate, and here's what the ideal trajectory looks like. And so it's made them much better drivers.
So in a sense, we're not, literally using the same like large language models. Like it's not a different version of Chat GPT or whatever that's kind of powering the cars, but we're using similar technology and techniques with the transformer technology that kind of powers large language models and kind of these, throw a giant data set at it. And I assume there's probably some aspect of human-driven reinforcement learning where you tell them like, no, you made a mistake here. Yes, you got this one correct, that kind of thing.
There's some of that, yeah. I mean, so I think the way that plays out is that they, once you build a system like this, the companies will send them out with safety drivers. And so you'll drive 1 million miles with a human being behind the wheel. And then if the car makes a mistake, the safety driver will, hit the brakes or grab the steering wheel. And then the situation will be captured and sent back to headquarters. And then that'll go into the training set. Okay, this is something you shouldn't do. Another big part of what all these companies are doing is they all have very sophisticated simulation engines. And so there's only so many miles you can do on real roads because, it's risky, and also because it costs money. You have to pay people to be safety drivers. And so what they try to do, and I think all of them, many of these companies have been pretty successful at it, is build simulators that give a very realistic, fake road where you can drive a billion miles on it on variations. So it'll take a situation that was tricky for the car, and they'll do 1 million permutations. Well, they'll say, okay, we'll move this car forward a foot, we'll move it backwards a foot, we'll add another car here, and they can do that in an automated way, so that the car has driven 10, 100, 1,000 times more miles on a server somewhere than it drives in the real world.
So there's a physical law here that has to be obeyed, right, when it comes to these systems. And the physical law is, if you have a podcast about technology and politics, you must mention Elon Musk at some point. That's a physical law of the universe at this point.
Yep.
And so I'm going to ask about Tesla, because it seems like actually a good transition in that, look, if it's one of the things that's valuable is having all this data, right? Is having all this data that you can pump into a system, and the more data you have, the better your AI is going to be. That's actually one of the great lessons I feel like we've all learned in the last 5 years, is that to some extent, you don't actually need crazy new techniques. What you need is just a gajillion lines of training data, and tons of computing power. And to some extent, that is the secret sauce, is just more. And so some people from Tesla or Tesla super fans or Musk's army of internet weirdos will claim that like Tesla is really, really well positioned because of this, because Tesla, collects data from all the Teslas that drive all around the world. And certainly Elon Musk loves to talk about how Tesla's going to have robo-taxis or full self-driving, which has meant like 8 different things at various points when he said full self-driving. I've lost track of what he actually means by that.
Yeah.
But I know Waymo is the company that is way out ahead right now. And I know that you've mentioned some startups here that are working on like the trucking, the long haul trucking problem.
Yeah.
What do we think about Tesla? Is Tesla going to be a real competitor in this space? Are they kind of an also ran? Are they completely hype? What's your view on like, is Tesla real or not in this space?
Well, right now, what Tesla is they're in a different market. There's every automaker has a driver assistance system where, my Kia, I can push a button and it will mostly stay in its lane and mostly keep a distance from the car ahead of it. I would say Tesla right now has one of the best versions of that, arguably the best one. And so I think that is a perfectly good product for them. So I think right now they're just in a different market, not really a competitor to Waymo. So Elon Musk has said they're building a robotaxi. And it's not clear if that means a totally new vehicle or an upgrade to existing vehicles, but there's supposed to be an event in October where he's going to unveil this supposedly. And I just think that I think it's absolutely true that Tesla, that the access to all that data is an advantage for Tesla, and it will allow them to proceed more quickly than they would have otherwise. I just think they're not where Waymo is yet. I've tried done a couple test drives with Tesla vehicles this year with version 12.3 of Tesla's FSD software, which is not the very latest, but it was the current version as of this spring. And it was pretty good. It could go for, tens of miles without making a mistake. But over a couple hours of driving, I interviewed like 3 or 4 times to prevent it from making pretty serious mistakes. And so that is not as good as Waymo, which goes probably thousands of miles between mistakes. And so, I think Tesla definitely could be on a path to having a viable driverless taxi service. I think they're just 2 to 4 years behind Waymo, and they may be able to catch up somewhat, but I think they're a few years away. I also think so. Data is one piece, but the other piece you need is there's just a lot of infrastructure you need to have a driverless taxi service. So the kind of stuff we were talking about before, you need to clean the vehicles, charge the vehicles, change flat tires, have customer service. And I don't see I don't see Tesla building that infrastructure right now. That doesn't mean they can't or won't in the future. But I think if Tesla, Elon Musk tomorrow was like, if they like had the technology ready and were ready to like roll out the robotaxi service, they talk as if we're just going to like flip a switch and every Tesla vehicle in the country is going to turn into a robotaxi. But again, like imagine like if it gets a flat tire, and the vision Elon Musk paints is, when you're not using your car, you'll push a button, it'll go out and give people rides, and then you'll generate revenue. But what if you do that? You go on vacation and then your car gets a flat tire. Like you're not going to come home from your vacation to fix the flat tire, right? Tesla is going to need a staff of people that can go out and do that. And Tesla has some service people around the country, but nowhere near enough. And so it's a different kind of product. It's not a software product, it's a service. And so anybody who wants to enter that market needs to do some scaling up in the same kind that Waymo's going to be doing over the next couple of years. And I see no reason that Tesla's existing fleet is going to give it a huge advantage, although it is sub-advantage.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me like a lot of these guys who think this way are in software world, or they come from software, which is a space where, like you can instantly multiply your scale 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. And that there's a little bit of complication there. Like you're going to have to purchase more servers from the Amazon Web Service, right? But like software is very, very easy to replicate at scale. It's the most scalable thing there is. Whereas physical cars are not infinitely scalable. You have to actually build more cars, and they have to be repaired and fueled or charged, and all that, all the stuff that you're mentioning. And it seems to me like that's the challenge, is getting people with kind of software brain, getting them to kind of tackle these like just messy, hard, unglamorous kind of problems.
Yeah, and I do think so the trajectory I see is, I think Waymo seems to be on a pretty good growth trajectory. So over the next 3 to 5 years, I expect them to expand to be, cover all the major metropolitan areas. And then at some point, I think they'll have a big enough coverage map that they can go to automakers and license their technology. You can go to Ford and say, look, pay us $100 a month, and we'll let you turn your cars into driverless cars. But you need to have that infrastructure in place first, because you need maps of all the places, and you need, service people to rescue the cars if they get stuck.
Oh, and can I actually break in there for a sec?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would love to break in to just say, or to just ask, how possible is that? Because I feel like there's two models of this. There's model number one, which is we build self-driving cars, and they are a distinct thing. This is a self-driving car. This other car is not a self-driving car. Right. But you've kind of introduced this idea of, what if Waymo just goes to Ford and says, hey, we'll modify your cars for, I don't know what it would be, $10,000 a car, or there's some cost, and your car, your Ford, can become a self-driving car. Do you have a sense of, number one, I guess, how possible that is? Like, are people working on that problem? And number two, a sense of like which path is kind of the more real route into the self-driving future? Is it completely like cars just are going to be made from the beginning to be self-driving cars by self-driving car companies? Or are they going to be like, no, Ford and Toyota and everybody else are going to make cars pretty much the same way they do now, and they're going to be retrofitted, or like there's going to be a separate step in the process to make them self-driving?
So auto manufacturing is hard. So I do not think Waymo is going to be manufacturing any cars. Right now what they're doing is they're taking cars from other companies and modifying them. But that process, what's called upfitting, adding sensors and stuff, is very expensive. And so in the long run, what they need to do is add the sensors and the other stuff in the assembly line. And so, yeah, I think that what will happen is that, so right now, Waymo's just buying Jaguar I-Paces and spending tens of thousands of dollars to just upfit them after the fact. But the next generation or two, I think Waymo will make a deal. So their next model will be with the Chinese company Zeekr. It's an electric vehicle that I think has more of this stuff built in from the assembly line. So the car will come off from the assembly line with some of this stuff attached. Although I think it still requires some upfitting. But then the generation after that, I would expect it to be completely manufactured at the facility. So there is extra stuff you need in the driverless car, but I don't think it's that expensive. And so the longer term...
Isn't that going to be a problem for Waymo, the importing Chinese cars? Didn't we just do like 100% tariff on Chinese cars or something like that?
That is absolutely good thinking there. Yes, Waymo announced this deal before the 100% tariff went on. And so it is unclear, is Waymo just going to pay that? Is Zeekr going to shift their production to Korea or something so they can get around that? Is Waymo going to get some kind of an exemption? It is, yeah. So that is definitely a headache they have. I don't know how they're going to solve it. But that's like a kind of a temporary thing. But yeah, in the long run, I think that there'll be like 20 years out, I think everybody who buys a car is going to want to have the option to push the button and have it be self-driving. And so gradually, I think it will require like a remodeling all these cars, but it won't be a huge change. And so over the next 20 years, I think we'll shift from most cars not being capable of self-driving to it just being a standard feature that every car has. And then you will, and I don't know, I used to be the kind of person who thought that like self-driving will mean that nobody will buy a car and like everybody will just rent, because potentially taxis could be much cheaper than they are today because there's no driver. And so the driver is like half the cost. And so you could imagine a world where taxis are extremely cheap. And so there's just see a big hassle to own a car. I've mellowed a little bit of that. I think people like car seats, so like to have the golf clubs in the trunk, etc. And so I would imagine taxis will be more popular than they are today, but a lot of people will still want cars. And it might be that what you get is a lot of leasing. So you'll lease a self-driving car for 3 years and then it'll drive away and a new one will drive in its place when you're done with it. Anyway, all that is to say, I think there will be some cars that are effectively personally owned. And in that case, you'll buy the car and then you'll pay $100 a month or whatever the rate is to have the self-driving feature. And then you'll be able to have it drive itself. But I don't think you can. I think you need to have the taxi service first because you need the maps and the infrastructure in place nationwide before this is compelling. Because if you bought a self-driving car that only drove it self-driving in the Bay Area, that wouldn't be a compelling product. You need to have kind of national coverage before that's a viable product for anybody.
All right, so we're coming up on time soon, but we've got enough time for just one or two more questions. I want to ask, as kind of a way to potentially close the podcast, what you see the self-driving car future looking like. And I'll allow you to get, whatever mix of like technical and artistic you want to do, and just kind of painting a picture here. What is this going to do to society? What is it going to do to productivity and the economy and jobs, to our free time, to safety, to, how does auto insurance work, in a world where not very many people drive? Just paint the picture of like how you see the major parts of society changing. And again, if you want to take some artistic license here just to paint a picture, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Because I feel like you would be one of the more informed guys to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder to predict. I mean, I definitely think there'll be big changes. I mean, think about the original invention of the automobile. It allowed the creation of suburbs and the invention of companies like Walmart. And so it's, I think this could be a change on that scale or pretty close to it. And so a few things. I mean, obviously, one of the biggest things is the commute will go away as as people having to pay attention to commute. So that'll free up an hour or so of time for any like person who previously commuted by car to do whatever they want in their vehicle. So that'll be a big thing. You could also imagine in the future driverless cars that are designed for longer trips. And so you can imagine, for example, cars that are like lie flat cars where you get in, you go to sleep in the evening, and you wake up the next morning in your weekend cabin or your lake cabin or whatever. So that could be pretty cool. I think it's going to have, I think it's unclear what the effect on sort of urban development will be, because there's arguments in both directions. So on the one hand, one of the big forces of NIMBYism is concerns about parking. And if you have much cheaper taxis, then that may become less of a concern because it becomes feasible for almost everybody who lives in a city to just rent taxis whenever they need to. And so people are less interested in having personally owned vehicles, in which case driverless cars could enable much denser development because there's less parking spaces and also less regulations about requiring a parking space per unit. So you could build a unit without parking. So that could be good. On the flip side, as I was saying a minute ago, this is going to make commutes much more pleasant. And so maybe you have more people who are happy to live 2 hours from the office, and they, do 2 hours of email each way. And, if you don't get car sick, maybe that's a perfectly good thing. So I could actually see both directions. I could see, I guess this would kind of intensify the popularity of big cities, because on the one hand, you'll have the Xers becoming even more exurban. On the other hand, you'll have maybe the kind of hottest neighborhoods having even denser development. So I think it'll have big impacts on the development patterns of cities, but it's a little bit ambiguous what the overall direction. Is it going to be denser or less dense and more or less sprawly? And in terms of insurance, that I think is actually pretty straightforward. I think just when the car's in self-driving mode, the Waymo in this case will be legally responsible, and so I think the personal insurance market will kind of gradually go away as fewer and fewer people are driving. And my hope is that the crashes will become infrequent enough that it just won't be much of a concern for the Waymos of the world, because crashes will be so infrequent that the companies just don't have to pay out that much.
I can imagine a world where actually like people are starting to become disincentivized from driving because human insurance is now so expensive and such a weird niche product that people are like, I don't want to get expensive human insurance, or maybe you even pay by the mile. Like if you drive only 10 miles a month, you get cheap insurance. But if you are one of those weirdos who insists on driving yourself everywhere, then you pay a lot more for your insurance. And so it actually like starts to disincentivize people from driving at all. I can imagine that being a future.
I mean, it's possible, but like one of the things we're learning from seeing the Waymo safety stats is that most of the crashes are caused by a small number of assholes, drug drivers or teenagers or people who are, very elderly people who are going senile. And so if you can shift those people off the road, then like human driving will get much safer, because the average human driver doesn't cause, the rates we were talking about before, that's an average of the safe and the dangerous drivers. If you can get most of the dangerous drivers to switch to self-driving taxis, then the few safe ones. And so I guess what I imagine, I don't think we're ever going to flatly prohibit people from driving. But I think society will be much more comfortable, for example, with taking away driving privileges from people who drive drunk, or requiring breathalyzers, having speed limiters. It'll be say, look, like you can drive your car, but given that you are much more dangerous than vehicles, we're going to be much more comfortable saying we're going to place some limited restrictions to make sure you actually do it safely. In that world, like I think the insurance rates could be very low because it actually would be a very safe activity. Also, like I think there'll be, to some extent, you'll be able to have more advanced versions of emergency braking, where maybe you have a car that's very difficult to crash. You try to, if you try to run into a brick wall, it would the brakes would kick in at the last minute and it would, not run into it. So I could see that going both ways. I think that I don't really envision insurance becoming radically more expensive, but I think you'll see a very gradual shift towards more pressure for people to stop driving, or at least more concerted effort to get the most dangerous drivers, the youngest, oldest, and intoxicated, distracted kind of drivers to stop.
That is a really interesting point that I had not thought of, that, like you said, dangerous drivers sometimes were hesitant to take away their ability to drive just because it's a really harsh societal punishment, whereas in the future it might not be that harsh. It's easy to take away. But with that, I think we're going to come to our final question. This is what we always ask. It's how we always close the podcast. And the traditional final question is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more? And I will be happy to go first and say, if you're interested in learning more about self-driving cars or about AI in general, you should definitely subscribe to Understanding AI, Timothy Lee's Substack. It's a great resource. It has, really good material on there about AI from all kinds of directions. So I'm happy to recommend you, Tim. But other than your own blog, what would you recommend for people who are interested in learning more about what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I appreciate the recommendation, and I want to mention it's understandingai.org. Somebody else got the .com just after I launched my newsletter, and that's not me. So make sure you do that .org. There's a great podcast called
don't go follow the imposter. There's only one real one.
That's right. Mine has much more in-depth analysis. There's a great podcast called the Autonocast that is like a weekly interview podcast with people inside this industry. That is really great. And then a book I really like, that's not like specifically about self-driving cars, but is about a lot of related topics, there's a book called The Alignment Problem by Brian Christian that came out about 4 years ago. And it has a chapter, I think, on self-driving cars that's pretty good. But it also is just a kind of ground up explanation of the big ideas of AI. And I particularly like, there's a lot of discussion of like racial bias in AI systems, and it actually managed to do. It had some kind of counterintuitive findings that I thought were really thoughtful. There's actually some like hard trade-offs between different ways of trying to make systems unbiased, and he really does a nice job of like going through the research and talking through the different pros and cons of approaching it in different ways. So that would be my number one book recommendation. So one other book that I really liked that's about AI rather than self-driving specifically was called The Worlds I See, which is by Fei-Fei Li, who was one of the pioneers of machine vision, machine image recognition. And she's an immigrant from China who has a really like great like life story, and created one of the early data sets that really started the machine learning revolution that led to self-driving cars. So The Worlds I See by Fei-Fei Li is also excellent.
All right. Well, I want to thank my guest, Timothy Lee, one more time for coming on the show today. His blog is, once again, understandingai.org. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was fun.